Welcome to the Clear to Send podcast, a podcast about wireless engineering, where we educate you on Wi-Fi technology, talk about design tips, troubleshooting, interviews, and the tools. Here are your hosts, Rowell and François.
Hi guys, François here. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast, and this is episode 181. Today we're talking about our experience setting up the new Cisco controller, Catalyst 9800. So this is François, your host, and I'm here with Rowell this morning. Hi Rowell, how are you?
Hey guys, good morning. We're here talking about Wi-Fi with coffee. You got your coffee, François?
No, not even. I don't even have.
Oh man,
I didn't have my coffee yet, so.
You sound so energetic.
Coffee Wi-Fi. I know at one point in the day I'm gonna have to have coffee, but guess what? I'm spending the week with Jerry Ola, and he's bringing some nice coffee from his.
Oh,
hometown.
very cool.
Yeah.
Tell Jerry I said hi.
No problem. Which feature do you want in Nika? How I can just
the feature request. Man, put me on the spot. I don't have any. It's working very well.
Anyway, so you and I, we both went through the process of setting up the new Cisco, Catalyst 9800 controller, the cloud version of the controller. We did it different ways. You did it on a VMware ESXi. I did it on a VMware Fusion on my laptop. So we just wanted to share that experience with you guys, right? We already documented everything in blog posts, and we'll share these at the end of in the show notes. I guess you guys can go and check them out. But we just wanted to spend some time here talking about some of the challenges we ran into, how long it took us to get it done, so it can give you an idea of what it would takes for you guys to make it happen on your end as well. Yeah, and this is still pretty new stuff.
It is. It's still very new. It's all Cisco iOS based wireless LAN controller, and I guess the reason is, why would you even want to install this, right? I mean, there's a lot of good use cases in using the 9800 cloud version, because one, you don't even need physical controllers anymore, right? You can have one virtual and have the benefits of using that in a virtual environment.
Yeah, I think so. For those of you who don't really know the new Catalyst platform, they pretty much rewrote the controller code on a Cisco iOS X platform or OS. And then, so now the controller is pretty much a software, and you could have it, as a virtual machine anywhere, like Rowell said, in the cloud or on a VM machine somewhere, or you could buy the controller as an appliance, and they would put the OS on the appliance. So you can have the choice to do whatever you want to do. Here, the one we're talking about is the cloud version. So it's just a software piece, just a VM, and they call it the CL version. I'm guessing it stands for cloud. Yeah,
it's the cloud.
But if you want to have an idea of the full portfolio that Cisco is offering, you can go on their website. We'll put the link as well in the show notes, so you guys can check out the full suite of Catalyst 9800 wireless controllers that they offer today.
Yeah, and so when I started, I did it on the VMware ESXi platform. François, you did it on VMware Fusion. Now we should note that you could run this in different environments. So they've got the KVM file. You can put this in Amazon AWS. There's an ISO file. There's a tar file for NFVIS. So you can definitely run this in different environments. We just chose the platforms we chose because, one, I have VMware ESXi at home, and François, you're always traveling, so for you to do some sort of lab work, it made sense for you to try to install this using VMware Fusion. So why don't we run through your environment first, because I think that's probably the most easiest for people, because that they tend to have access to some sort of VM solution on their laptop. And I guess we'll find out, what is the experience of running this on a laptop.
Yeah, for sure. So for me, obviously the goal for me wasn't to set up a controller for a production environment. The goal for me was just to test out the new Wi-Fi 6 access point they gave us when we did the event at Cisco back in April.
That's the Just the Tech event.
Just the Tech event. Thank you. And so I wanted to test it out, and I wanted to also get familiar with the new, controller platform, because everything changes. The way you configure your network, the GUI, the experience you have as an engineer working with the product is changing. So I wanted to get familiar with that, and I wanted to play with Wi-Fi 6. So I needed a lab environment, something I could quickly spin on and turn on, so I could test those features on my access points. So that was really the use case for my setup. So that's why I decided to install it on my laptop. And then, as you said, I'm on the go quite often, so I can just travel with my access point, a little PoE switch, connect that to my use that to power on the AP, and then connect it to my laptop. I have the controller running on the VM on my laptop, and then it's just a matter of turning everything up, and then I'm ready to do my testing. So the on my laptop I have VMware Fusion, so I use that for the setup. And it wasn't so I'm not really a VM guy at all. I understand the concepts and the different pieces, but I'm not really into configuring VM very often. So for me, it wasn't very easy thing to do. I followed a blog article that Timo Sass from Germany created a while back, and he sent it to me. So I started by using that, and then my VMware. So I set up my VM on VMware, and then when I went back to configure some of the networking settings, because for the controller to work properly, you need to define a new network card, right? Or network interface. When I went back in the GUI to do that in VMware Fusion, I know the option was grayed out, and I couldn't do it via the GUI. So I was like, man, this is not working. So I was like, okay, let's try VirtualBox. So I installed VirtualBox on my Mac, and I went through the same process, and then I had other issues that that would like require me to go to CLI and then do more advanced work. So I was like, maybe that's not the right way to do things. Let me go back to Fusion and see if I can fix it. So I went back to Fusion and then did a couple of research online, and then people were explaining how you could actually change the configuration of your VM by changing some configuration files, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I started to do. I started to go and then look for on my OS, on my Mac OS, look for the configuration files related to the VM that I just created in VMware Fusion, and I started to try to see, okay, how can I change the settings? Which settings do I need to add if I want to add a network interface? And I went through the process. I communicated back with Timo so he could share what he had for his setup as well. And so little by little, I used that to make it work on VMware Fusion, right? And then after the whole process, I was happy. I was like, yes, it works. And then, so that's kind of like the idea of, us sharing the information, because we want to help you guys not going through the same experience. Yeah. So hopefully if you go through our blog, it's easier for you guys. I'll be happy.
I had no clue you had to modify the configuration file, François. I thought it was easy for you.
Yes, that might be specific to my case. I don't know why the options were grayed out in VMware in the GUI, right? But you know what? Funny thing. After I modified the configuration file, and then I opened VMware Fusion back, I could actually see the options in the GUI now. It's like they became available all of a sudden.
Yeah, so that's weird. There must have been a setting in that file that you enabled for that to show up. But yeah, that I can see how that would cause a lot of confusion and then maybe discourage someone from installing it through VMware, especially if that happens. You can't modify some of these settings and get it working the way you should so you can have this connectivity. But yeah, I mean, that sounded like you went through some trouble to try to get that controller working.
And I remember I was in France at my parents, and I probably spent like almost one day making it work. So I was very happy at the end of the day. I was like, and like I said, I'm not a VMware guy, so I got frustrated pretty fast.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm happy I went through the experience, because if I have to do it again, or if I have to, advise customer, I would kind of know where to go and what to say.
Yeah, and at least now you could show it as a demo, right? Like show somebody what the new 9800 cloud controller looks like, and that you've easily done it through your laptop and showing what the possibilities are. How about after you got it running, were you able to configure it pretty easily? What were your thoughts there?
Yeah, the configuring the controller part was the easiest for me. I kind of, I don't really like the automatic setup. So, when it prompts you at first, you want to go through I forgot how they call it, like the, it's kind of like they guide you through the process of configuring the controller.
The day zero config.
I always say no.
Okay.
And then I just do it myself. And so I pretty much used the deployment guide from Cisco. And that's also a document that is very useful. And we'll link in the show notes. And then it walks you through the different steps you have to do to get it, connected to the network, giving an IP address, do all the basic stuff. And I'm sure you had to go through the same stuff. But what the new controller is requiring you to do is, assign an IP address, assign a route, configure the country code, configure username and password so you can actually, connect to the box. Configure management interface, and then generate certificates so the DTLS connection between the controller and the APs is working fine. And then once you have that, you can actually go in your browser and then HTTPS to the IP address you've defined, and then connect using the username you have defined using the CLI. And then from there, you should be up and running. So the configuration fine, the initial setup and configurations wasn't really too complex.
Okay, yeah, that doesn't sound too bad, because it's like configuring a controller from CLI or configuring a switch from the CLI, and it really is like a router or a switch. It's running ESXi. So, and I would say the most important part is that DTLS connection, because if you don't configure that, the certificate, if you don't configure that, your APs won't be able to join the controller.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not complex. It's just one command line.
Yeah. And it's even easier in the GUI if you were to just do that initial configuration through the GUI. There's also a drop down, which I can talk about, because I went through. So Francois, what type of file did you download from Cisco's site?
So in my case, I used the ISO file.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll also add a link to where you can download the Cisco Cloud Controller. You do have, I guess it's like a trial, basically, when you run this. I think once you add an access point to the controller, that trial starts, the countdown starts going, but at least you'll be able to take it as a lab environment and run through the installation.
Yeah, and I should also mention that you have to pay for VMware Fusion. I think you have like 30 days free, but after that you have to pay. So it's not the VMware Fusion on your laptop on macOS is not necessarily a free application.
Yeah, so this is not a 100% free way to do a lab environment of the 9800 CL. 30 days is still pretty good, and then however long the trial is on the controller itself.
If you can make it work on VirtualBox and share that with us, that could be a free way to do it.
Okay. Yeah, that would be neat, because there are a lot of people maybe who are just students trying to learn how to use this, and that would be the best option for them. If not, VMware Fusion makes it a lot easier. All right. So should I jump into the VMware ESXi version?
Yes, please. Okay. Well, tell us how you did it.
All right. So
let's start with the hardware. What do you need?
Yeah. So for VMware ESXi, you definitely need something to host to that. I have 2 Intel NUCs. And the first problem I ran into was I was trying to install the 9800CL on an Intel NUC that had an Intel i5 processor, and that just clearly did not work for me. I had issues doing that, and it just wouldn't run. And so I switched over to my other Intel NUC, which is an i7. It's a Core i7 processor. And that NUC also had 32 gigs of RAM. So I find that this controller is pretty resource hungry. I think the small environment or model configuration has a minimum of 4 virtual CPUs and a minimum of 8 gigabytes of RAM. So I ended up sticking with my i7 processor there. And I can link out to like what pieces of hardware I'm using to create the Intel NUC. And then, of course, you have to install VMware ESXi, which we won't go into in this episode, but it's still fairly easy. Maybe fairly easy for me because I used to be a systems administrator and I used to deal with VMware, but it's not too bad to install. So once you've got VMware ESXi running, then you got to download the OVA file from Cisco, and that's going to be basically your VM that you import into VMware. Now, if you're running the full VMware like vCenter suite, you got all those. You have you paid license to run this, for example. There's a nice import tool that you could use, but when you're using VMware ESXi, which you can run this for free. I run a couple of VMs. You have to download this tool called the VMware Open Virtualization Format tool. And this tool is going to help transfer that OVA file over to VMware ESXi. The downside for me was it wasn't a GUI tool, which meant I had to use command line. And before we even do that, there's this file that you have to create called the OVA file, which the OVF tool is going to use. And that file kind of sets it up initially, the VM. So it'll there's options for you to accept all the EULAs, so you don't have to read through that. You can tell it what data store to deploy the VM to, what the deployment option is, which I chose the small deployment option. There's also a medium and a large. But for lab purposes, you just need the small deployment option. You can give it a name and what network interfaces you're going to add to the VM. So now it's important to know that if you're going to add the network interfaces, those network interfaces have to be pre-configured on VMware ESXi. Ugh. It's early. So you have to have those configured there, and I outlined that in the blog post. I would say maybe this is probably the more difficult part if you're not a VMware guy. So once you save that file, you can then use the OVF tool and the command line interface to import that into VMware ESXi. You just give it the path of where the OVA file is, which is the controller, and then details for your VMware host. The command line was something you had. I had to figure out what this command line was, and there's a document that I also outline in my blog, like where to this is the command line option to use. It is in the deployment guide for the controller, so you have to look at that pretty carefully. And then, just like what you went through, François, like once you've got that imported and you start the VM, you can see it, doing all the hardware checks and whatnot as things as a iOS XE device boots up. And then you get that initial prompt, the auto install, which I also said no, but I did try the auto install just to see if there's any differences there. But personally, I felt that terminating the auto install and just configuring it is the easiest way to go. And there are some things specifically you need to define in order for the controller to work. Because this is iOS XE, you got to treat it like a router. And there's the interface in which my the controller was using to my vSwitch. See, you got to understand ESXi. The vSwitch connects to my network, my physical switch. You have to understand like what those mappings are. And so I'm using port 1 on the controller. I had to define an IP address there. And then because it's like a router, you have to define the gateway or the route to the gateway. So if you guys have configured a router before, you got to do that IP route command, and then the all zeros, and then the gateway. And then you can configure the username and password. So from there, once you do that, you can log in to the controller with the IP address you've configured, which then goes through this configuration. So there's that initial CLI configuration just to get the IP address on there. If you wanted to configure everything else through the GUI, the controller specifically, you can go through what's called this day zero configuration, which is very similar to what François talked about, but it's just in the GUI format, right? So it asks you a bunch of questions like, what do you want to call this? Name this controller, NTP servers. You can set up the wireless management interface. So the IP address that you set up is kind of like the out of band management. You can actually set up the management interface on the controller on a specific VLAN if you wanted to, configure WLANs, some other settings, just like basic to get started, including that certificate you'll need in order for the APs to join. And then you could hit finish and it'll reboot. And then you've got a controller that you can log into. Now that sounds really easy. I think I got it up and running within, I don't know, it was like under 30 minutes, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And I did install it a couple of times, but there were some things that I noticed where I would go through that day zero configuration and hit finish. It would reboot and then it would go back into the day zero setup again. And I was thinking like, why is it doing this? I already set it up. Why do I have to keep doing this? And I think I was hitting some sort of bug. So I tried modifying a few settings or not changing any settings. So I'm pretty sure it was a bug in versions 16.10. I think it's resolved in 16.11. But one way around that was to just do everything through CLI, and you wouldn't run into that issue. I think it was just a day zero GUI configuration bug. But if you just went through the CLI, which you can do that just as you went through it, François, it's possible to just configure it that way and get going even faster.
Yeah, and you've documented everything you just talked about, right? So you even have a nice video.
Yeah, I had to make a video because I wanted to show people. And what's funny is when I was making that video, I ran into the bug. And so I had to like pause it and go, why again am I having to go through this? And then keep recording. But it is an interesting process because if you think about how we traditionally get configured controllers, right? You get a piece of hardware, you got to mount that, you've got to do all the configuration bits of the controller. I find that the virtual, even though I ran into some of those issues, I still think it was a lot easier to install in a VM environment because you don't have this physical controller. You can put resources to this virtual machine. So even if I started off at the smaller model, I mean, having the possibility to add more RAM or more virtual CPUs, that's a good thing. Now, that's not to say that this controller's not 100% like VM friendly, I guess, because you can't do vMotion with it yet. I think in a future release, they plan on doing that. But those are the advantages I see with deploying this in a virtual environment, is being able to say, if you put this in AWS, have it redundant in like the West Coast region and maybe move it to the East Coast region. I don't know.
Yeah, the AWS option is actually very attractive. You just have to understand, how much it's going to cost you to run it on your environment. That's kind of like, what's not fully clear right now. But as people start using it, maybe we can, come up with a better idea of how much it's going to cost.
Yeah, because I think
it in AWS.
We had this conversation because you and I were 3 hours apart. We were like, okay, what if we deploy this in AWS and we join both of our APs to the single controller? And then we started thinking about the cost of running it in AWS. Are we really going to use it, or?
Not sure. I was talking to Steven from Cisco, and he was like, it's about $60 a month, but it obviously depends on how much you're using it, right?
Right. Yeah. So those are some of the challenges to consider doing this in AWS. And now it's not sending all your user traffic up there. It's going to act more of like a Flex Connect model, but still having that, having any type of data going in and out of that VM in the cloud, still going to drive some sort of cost, because the controller's got to talk to the APs and control them. And so it'd be curious to see what a large deployment looks like using AWS. But one of the things I was looking at was the multi-tenancy portion, right? Like what if you had multiple clients? They didn't want controllers, but you can manage different environments using a single controller because of the way configuration is done on these new 9800s. It's not the same configuration model as your Air OS, which we'll go into in a future episode, talking about the actual configuration model and how that differs. But that started triggering ideas for me with the 9800.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's going to be a good idea for us to just follow up with you guys on, what's different from the Air OS platform, and once you're done setting the controller up, like how do you actually configure the controller? How do you add an access point? How do you configure your access point? How do you configure your SSID? And maybe we can come back and talk about that experience as well.
Yeah, we can do some differences, like how is this done in Air OS and how is it done in the 9800? Yeah, so that's what we have to look forward to. I would say overall the experience was pretty good for the 9800. I didn't think it was too bad. I had some initial issues, but that's just me running through things without actually reading the deployment guide. I wanted to see how easy it was without reading anything, and then you had to read something.
Yeah. It's not like the microwave where you never look at the manual, right? Yeah, for me the experience was good as well. I was happy to make it work, especially the VM part. I had to struggle a little bit, but hopefully my experience can serve other people, and then they don't have to struggle as much on the end.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah. I mean, that's all I had with my experience. I think, yes, this is looking good for Cisco. Looking forward to what else they deploy, or what else they develop for this platform. And I think this is the future of Cisco wireless.
Yeah, I think the platform will be more reliable. And then it's kind of like the future of doing things, right? So they integrated into the Catalyst portfolio. They using iOS XE. So I'm actually pretty excited about the product, and I have positive feelings about it. So like we said, we put our blog post in the show notes, so you guys can go back and see all the details, the command lines that Rowell was talking about, and all the settings that we use for our setup. And then we'll follow up with more episodes on the Catalyst 9800 once we get to play a little bit more with it, and we can share that with you guys. In the meantime, you can find the show notes at clearedsand.net/181, clearedsand.net/181, and feel free to reach out to us, on the social media platforms and on Twitter at clearedsand, LinkedIn, and we'll be happy to exchange with you guys. Thank you for listening, and I guess we'll tune in again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.